Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to important issues to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and in our world.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show. On today's program, I want to talk about how to have safe and reliable elections. Our guest today is attorney T. Russell Nobile. Mr. Nobile works for an organization you've probably heard of called Judicial Watch. Judicial Watch is led by Tom Fitton, a fantastic attorney in Washington. And Judicial Watch specializes in rooting out and exposing government corruption. They're constantly filing lawsuits and making Freedom of Information Act requests at the national and state levels across the country. And I think Judicial Watch has probably done more than any other organization I can think of to expose the deep state corruption of the Obama-Biden years. One of the things they've been very diligent about is using the courts to get states to clean up their voter rolls. They have, according to their website, caused 5 million names to be that were improperly on voter rolls to be removed in states across America. But before we get to our interview with Mr. Nobile, I'd like to share my thoughts about election integrity and the state of our elections in America. You know, in the old days, meaning before 2000, we voted on paper ballots in person at a polling station after showing an ID, and the ballots were counted by hand. I don't remember having massive problems getting the job done. In fact, I remember many election nights where we would sit up and watch the returns. Sometimes it would take much of the night for there to be an announcement about the winner, especially at the presidential level, as they're waiting for states on the West Coast and Hawaii and Alaska and other things like that to send their returns in. And sometimes we didn't know until 2 in the morning. There were many times I remember waking up as a child and seeing a headline on the paper that says, you know, Ronald Reagan wins 1980 election, or whatever the case may be. I don't remember any time until infamous 2020 election where polling stations at many places in the country suddenly called it quits and went home for the night in order to resume counting later. But in the 2020 election, that's exactly what happened. You remember, late in the night, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, Donald Trump was leading in several swing states. And then suddenly we start hearing reports that these polling stations in Philadelphia and Atlanta and other swing states were, they're going to stop for the night, go home, get some rest, come back, we'll finish up in the morning. This one's so tight, so close, we just won't know. Boy, it could be days before we know the results they told us. I remember sitting on my sofa and going, what in the world is going on here? Poll watchers were sent home. And then reports began to emerge about semi-trucks full of ballots showing up at polling stations, videos coming out of, boxes being pulled out from underneath tables that were covered with cloth, suddenly full of ballots, and then being scanned in after the poll watchers were gone. And then we all woke up the next day and we saw, wait, Biden is now in the lead and even the winner. How did that happen? We saw charts that showed the voting by, every 15 minutes or every hour or whatever. And all of a sudden at 3 in the morning, now I may have my specifics wrong, but you guys know what I'm talking about. All of a sudden there's a spike straight up the page of Joe Biden votes. And we were told, don't pay attention to this. This is the safest and most reliable election in American history. Conservatives and even everyday Americans all over, I don't want to say conservatives aren't everyday Americans, but I mean even moderates and independents, began to get the very sick feeling that a major coup had just taken place. This candidate, Joe Biden, was hardly out on the campaign trail at all. The phrase was that he was in his basement, right, where they told him to stay. He was unable to draw crowds of any significant size, and nothing anywhere close to what Donald Trump was drawing. He and his running mate, Kamala Harris, had trouble speaking in intelligible sentences. Donald Trump won more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. And he barely won in he won in 2016. And yet we were supposed to believe that Joe Biden, the Sleepy Joe, won more votes than Barack Obama in 2012. Folks, it didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense now. Lawsuits began to be filed, but it was crazy. It felt disorganized and hectic, and one by one they were dismissed, many of them on technicalities, legal technicalities like lack of standing and other things. We were told repeatedly by the media that 2020 election was safe. We were called election deniers. Audits were done in Arizona and in elsewhere that showed serious problems with the election. The Maricopa County election audit showed that thousands and thousands of voters were allowed to vote there who were not qualified, who didn't even live in Maricopa County anymore. But because supposedly the number of valid ballots or problems wasn't enough to change the result, we were told the audit confirmed the election. Yet the media just kept telling us there was no concern. We saw reports that voting machines were vulnerable to hacking, something that had been previously identified as a problem for years before 2020. In 2012, in 2016, do you remember even Hillary talking about Russian interference and the need to secure our elections? Oh, but now in 2020 when Biden wins, oh, don't pay any attention to these vulnerable election machines, right? And yet no one was able, or no one appeared to really come forward with proof, definitive proof to say, no, these machines are secure. Well, in 2021, just a few months later, a county clerk in Mesa County, Colorado, named Tina Peters, became concerned. She was hearing from citizens in her community that the election results were not right, that it seemed off. Candidates were winning who no one thought had a chance to win. While that in and of itself is not that uncommon, volunteers in her community did canvassing of neighborhoods, taking the voter rolls and going and knocking on doors, and they were finding that voters on the voter rolls didn't match people that were living at these houses they were knocking on, the doors they were knocking. As they went to these addresses, the voters didn't live at the addresses where they were registered. Her county had municipal elections in the spring of 2021, so just a few months after the infamous 2020 elections, and again, complaints began surfacing. The Secretary of State of Colorado, Jenna Griswold, announced, we're going to have a trusted build, is what she called it. And this was where they were going to replace the data on the election machines with new data. We're going to install a software update. Jenna Griswold, of course, is a hard-left progressive. Many people say that she's backed by George Soros. And this update was not going to preserve all of the files related to these previous elections. Even though federal law requires that all election records be preserved for 22 months, Colorado law required they be maintained for 25 months. Tina Peters was concerned about this trusted build, and she asked for more time to investigate, but was denied. The trusted build would go on as planned and don't get in the way. She tried to get a county employee with technical skills to help her make a copy of the server on the election machines, but they refused. Now, Ms. Peters ultimately found a non-employee to help her do that job. A forensic audit of that hard drive on the server in Mesa County showed that a secret database was created on the machine after vote counting began. That's right. It happened inside the machine. This secret database was created and began processing votes. It also showed that 28,000 election-related files were destroyed and not preserved. Now, so-called experts have looked at it and have said, oh, don't worry about that. There's nothing wrong with it. All the votes were counted, and those 28,000 files, they don't have anything to do with anything important, and that's not really what the law means when it says election records. Well, Tina Peters went public with the server information, And she was prosecuted. She was prosecuted by government authorities in Colorado for every crime they could think of. Local, state, and federal authorities raided her home, her friends' homes. They confiscated cell phones, tablets, electronics all over the place because they were going to make an example of her. At the trial of her case, substantial amounts of evidence about the history of what led up to her actions was excluded by the judge, including, as I understand it, the results of the forensic review of the election machine. And after the jury's guilty verdict, the judge sentenced Tina to 9 years in prison. That's right, 9 years. And when he did, he lectured her about being an election denier and said that she was dangerous because of the things she said. She's still serving in prison right now. Even the left-wing governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, has admitted that her sentence was probably too severe. We at Truth and Liberty don't necessarily approve of every method Tina used to preserve the record of those elections, but we do applaud her courage, her tenacity, and her desire to stand for truth. As I said in the beginning, our guest today is T. Russell Noble. He's a senior attorney at Judicial Watch. His practice focuses on election integrity, civil rights, constitutional law, and matters involving official misconduct. He's appeared in federal and state courts nationwide, including the United States Supreme Court, and he's testified before the United States House Judiciary Committee as well as other committees. In fact, Attorney Noble just testified this week before a committee of Congress looking into the question of how to make our elections safer. And so we're really looking forward to sitting down with Attorney Noble today to talk about this massively important subject of election integrity. And I want to say one other thing before we go to our break and go to the interview with Russell Noble. Pending before Congress right now is a bill called the SAVE Act. And the bill is held up in the United States Senate. This act needs to get passed because what it will do is it will require that an ID, one of many different kinds, be presented when people register to vote and when they vote. And it will require that the person's identity be confirmed and that their citizenship be confirmed. Frankly and honestly, I can't imagine what's wrong with this law. Why wouldn't we want this in our country? Every other industrialized nation that has elections in the world has voter ID. America, supposedly the leader of the free world, the example of democracy and republicanism, we're the only ones who don't. And the Democrats are screaming and crying, oh, you're going to disenfranchise people. Can I just ask how, right? That argument to me seems to be the most insulting argument to minorities that I've ever heard. Oh, minority people in this country may not have ID. Oh, really? Why don't you go walk the streets in minority communities and just ask them, do you have a driver's license? Do you have a driver's license? Do you have a driver's license? Do you know how to get a driver's license? Do you know how to get an ID? I promise you that the vast majority know how to get IDs. We need identification for so many things in life today. Everything from going to a movie that's rated R, to buying alcohol, to getting into a concert, to filling out forms online, registering for this, registering for that, going to school, going to college. I mean, everybody requires an ID for just about everything. But we can't require it for one of the most important things we do, voting. No. Why are they opposing that? Well, I just want to submit to you very bluntly. I don't think it's because they're worried about people's voting rights. I think they're worried about them winning elections. And they know that it's going to limit their ability to mobilize people who ought not to be voting. Can I just say it that way? Right? And so they throw up this smoke screen about worrying about, voting rights and nonsense like that. And it's just ridiculous, right? And so we need voter ID in America to register to vote and to vote every time without exception. This should be the rule, the law of the land. And if we'll get this in place, it won't fix everything, but it will help, and it needs to be done today. So I want to encourage you to call your congressman and your senator and tell them today, vote for the SAVE Act. I approve the SAVE Act. Get it done. All right, folks, so let's take a break now. I'm going to share some information with you, and after that, I'll be right back with this amazing interview of T. Russell Nobile, an attorney for Judicial Watch.
It can be tough being a pastor in a world that seems to have gone mad, where the wolves wear suits and laws try to silence the pulpit. But you're not alone. That's why we created the Pastor's Toolkit, trusted, ready-made resources to help your church engage biblically in public life. Equip your congregation, transform your community, be salt and light. Visit truthandliberty.net.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Truth and Liberty. My guest today, as I mentioned in the monologue, is attorney T. Russell Nobile. And Russell works for Judicial Watch, one of the most important watchdogs, if you will, in America today. They do fantastic work, and I'm just so honored and happy to have Russell joining us on the show today. Thanks for coming on the show today, Russell. It's good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so you're a senior attorney with Judicial Watch. I know that Tom Fitton leads Judicial Watch, and it must be just a great honor for you to work for them. But let me ask you this. Can you just share with our viewers a little bit about what is Judicial Watch and what do you guys do?
So we're a conservative nonprofit, political or public education organization that mostly does litigation and investigations. And sort of our bread and butter has traditionally been public disclosures and public records law, FOIA, as is commonly known. And so we're probably the biggest FOIA shop ever, and certainly in the country right now. We've been there for about 35 years. And so over the time, they've had a good bit of success doing the public records laws. And so about 15 years ago, they started expanding. And one space they got into was election integrity. And they started it in-house, but they, were having trouble sort of getting oriented. And so a few years later, they started bringing a few of us in-house. And so, we do mostly public records, but then there's a few of us that are specialists internally that do a few other things like election and voting law. So I'm part of a 3-person team with Bob Popper and Eric Lee, and we're the election shop inside Judicial Watch. And so we just do basically any type of election integrity suit we can come up with all over the country.
Well, one of the things you guys have done just amazing work at is getting states across America to clean up their voter rolls. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so last April we issued a press release. So I think we've had 5 million ineligible voters removed. If everyone's familiar with it, in 1993, Congress passed the National Voter Registration Act, commonly known as Motor Voter Bill, and it had a provision in there to help people get on the rolls, and it has a provision in there mandating that states make a reasonable effort to keep clean voter registration list. And so with the election team, one of our sort of, core missions is to enforce the list maintenance provisions. And we have Bob Popper in our office who did it at the DOJ. I did it at the Department of Justice with him. And Bob's an excellent list maintenance lawyer. And so we've been chiefly responsible for enforcing the list maintenance provision. Certainly, during the Biden administration and the Obama administration, they weren't doing it at all. And so when the DOJ really goes in the background, we're still there every few years filing a slate of new cases. And right now we have 3 pending, Oregon, California, and Illinois, to force them to clean their voter registration list up.
Well, so why, that sounds really kind of bureaucratic, but why is that important, Russell, that we have accurate voter rolls in our country?
Well, so voter registration sort of came about in the 1800s, right? Because they needed when poll sites grew, they needed to know who was there and who was qualified to vote. And, almost all the problems that occur with elections begin with inaccurate voter registration lists, whether it's fraud, suspicion of fraud, people not being able to vote, people voting in the wrong location, misallocation of congressional seats to a lesser extent. most of the election administration problems begin with an active voter registration list. And so, as the registration list goes, so does the rest of the election. And so, it's really important for states to maintain, or at least attempt to maintain, a reasonably up-to-date voter registration list. I mean, people move all the time, right? America, we're a very transient population. Some parts of the country see 10 or 15%, moving every other year on a 2-year rolling basis. And so, in a big state, certainly in a place like Manhattan and California that are very dynamic and people are moving a lot, you have inflated voter registration lists if states are not moving people off really quickly.
So, Russell, I remember after the 2020 elections, there were just lawsuits all over the place challenging the results and the processes and how states were ignoring the law and other things like that. And it seemed like many of those cases were dismissed by the courts because of a lack of standing. Do you recall that being the case? And can you tell us what's the standing thing? Just educate our viewers a little bit on it.
Yeah. All right. So let's just talking about 2020. It's really important to sort of talk about, the cases where they filed before the election or after the election, and sort of like segregating them and trying to explain them. So standing is this concept under federal law that you can't just go into court because you hate something. My marginal tax rate is too high. I can't just go into court and sue over it, or I don't like this, or I don't like that. You have to have a unique injury, right? And that idea is to keep the courts out of doing stuff that the legislators are supposed to do. And, Article 3 in standing is this idea that it limits courts' jurisdiction to do things that should be going through the Congress. And so in 2020, remarkably, frankly, many of the courts said that Donald Trump did not have standing to sue over some of the procedures in his elections. And, we could talk at length about the procedures and, the problems that happened in the election. But one of the big problems that happened in the election, of course, is that they were changing rules, at the last minute in the way they're not supposed to. And so Donald Trump sued over that. And, incidentally, we actually won a case at the Supreme Court last month, which I'm happy to talk about, that actually cleaned that whole mess up on standing.
Well, that's going to be my next question, Russell, is if you could, I know the case was for Congressman Mike Bost and some other plaintiffs. Can you tell us what happened in that case?
Yeah, so a couple years ago, right after the 2020 election, we decided that we're going to get federal courts to either stop this practice of receiving ballots and accepting ballots, get elections to stop counting ballots received after Election Day, or and explain to the public why that can happen. And so we sued Illinois on behalf of Congressman Bost, we allowed us to represent him, and we sued Illinois over the practice of allowing ballots to be received after Election Day. And, we thought we would, have a pretty easy sledding in terms of getting a court to hear the actual merits. But they continue to make these sort of really bad standing rulings, and chiefly relying on some of the bad rulings from the Donald Trump post-election disputes. They threw our case out for 3.5 years. And the great thing about Judicial Watch is they will, the contributors support us, and so we will grind it out, right? We will stay there. People will go to bed at night and think this thing went away, and then 6 months later, we're still there. We're like a zombie. Like, you're not going to kill us until the court finally throws us out. And so we touched every base. We went to every court we had to do. We did it slow and methodical, and then we kept losing, though. And the court kept saying that Congressman Bost did not have standing, and frankly, that's preposterous. And so we asked the Supreme Court to review the lower court's decision. The court heard our arguments in October. We had Paul Clement argue it for us, one of the most prolific Supreme Court litigators in the world, in the history of America at least. And I think June 14th or 17th, the Supreme Court announced 7-2 that we won. So, or that we had standing, and then remanded the case back to the lower courts to hear it.
Yeah. So the whole standing thing, the Supreme Court of the United States is now saying that a candidate for an election has standing to sue over that election for a variety of grievances, and we're gonna start hearing these cases. What does that mean for elections going forward? Are we going to have a greater capacity to enforce standards of fairness and accuracy in the courts?
We should be able to, right? I mean, when you file a lawsuit and you have to fight standing and the courts are not trying to hear the case, they can keep you tied up for years on end, as they tried to do with us. And so that should expedite things. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to win the merits portion of the arguments, but frankly, I think it goes a long way for the public to accept the outcome of an election, to actually hear the reasoning, right? I mean, like, courts have to give reasoning. And, part of the problems with 2020 is that, there were clear problems with the election. There was definitely some procedures and practices that either weren't followed or violated whole cloth. And the courts the courts closed themselves off to give the people any answer as to why. And so that obviously made the situation worse. And so, yeah, it should be a lot easier, because this gives us now the power to go into court and enforce existing election integrity laws, right? Like, I can go in court now, or I can, on behalf of my client, go into court and get the courts to follow or enforce existing election integrity provisions. And we haven't been able to do that, or at least that was, not allowed the last 5 years.
Yeah, and so you just, I think, testified in front of Congress just this week on election integrity issues. Am I right?
Yeah, on Tuesday morning, yeah.
Yeah, what was that about?
Well, it's going through Congress right now is the SAVE Act and something called the Make Elections Great Again Act, MEGA Act. And so the House Committee on Administration, which oversees a lot of election rules, invited me to testify. And so we testified about certain provisions of that law that we really, we think the Congress should adopt, and hopefully they will.
Yeah, tell us what's in the law or the bill, and what are the chances of it getting through, do you think?
So the bill has a couple great provisions. There's two, like I said, there's two acts. There's the SAVE Act, which is more of the voter ID and documentary proof of citizenship requirement. And then there's the MEGA Act that has both those requirements and a lot more. So in the MEGA Act, obviously the citizenship requirement, the proof of the voter ID requirement are really big. But for me, those are big and the most popular. But for me, the most important one is the ban on all mail balloting, because, once they start sending out ballots, to everybody, that especially when they have inaccurate voter registration lists, you don't know who's voting.
That's right.
And, we invented the poll site, or we invented the private ballot to keep people from being pressured outside or pressured on how to vote. And now that you're sending ballots to people's homes, you've got a real risk of ballot harvesting and pressure campaigns to force people to vote a certain way. I mean,
yeah.
I told in my testimony, I find this funny. I don't know if anybody else does, but there's something called the Australian ballot, which is basically what we use, this private ballot. You go in the booth and you mark your ballot privately. They invented that they adopted that in the 1860s and 70s because people were being paid so many people were being paid to have a vote. They needed to stop that practice. So they went to the private ballot, and as a result of that, turnover collapsed because people weren't getting bribed anymore how to vote. And so we're sort of going back to the bad old days of old with this all-mail balloting. So we're really, hopefully the Congress will adopt that. I don't know if they're going to be able to, they've got such a razor-thin margin in the House and an even smaller margin in the Senate. Congress is a whole black box. You're never really sure what goes in and goes out, So, yeah. And they never do anything until there's an actual deadline, right? Till they have to go on recess. So I'm hopeful they will, but I'm not measuring for curtains yet.
Russell, we're headquartered here in Colorado, which is, according to Jenna Griswold, is the gold standard on election integrity. You remember in 2021, the World Series got moved from Atlanta to Colorado because Georgia dared to pass an election reform law, and so they yanked the World Series in protest and put it here where we have all mail-in ballots. My son lived with us, after the age of 18 for a couple of years, so he got registered to vote here, but he's 25 now. And he moved to Oklahoma, back where our family was from, and called in to request his name to be removed, filled out the form online. But regardless of his efforts, we still, every election, get a ballot in the mail for him. And you guys have sued Colorado. You say, clean up these rolls. You entered a settlement. They said, we will. Have they done it?
Not according to recent data. I mean, every 2 years, states have to publish, new data, and so we'll know soon if they have. Usually this summer, Colorado's getting to be, a real problem. But, if your son filled out a form and told them he's changed his address and they're still sending him a ballot, that's a violation. The problem with it is, in terms of enforcing it, we have to show like a systemic failure, and that comes from data, right? The anecdotes are helpful. They show violations, but the law says they make a reasonable effort.
So this voter ID requirement, I know it's really popular. To me, it's complete common sense. I'd like to get your take on it. First off, tell us, would it make a difference in having accurate and safe elections if we required people to present a picture ID when they go to vote?
Of course, and it would make people feel more confident about the elections too. I mean, it's not just actual fraud; it's the appearance of fraud. People have to trust their elections, and having voter ID would go a long way towards that.
And isn't it true that just about every industrialized country that has a democratic system requires voter ID except for America?
Yes.
So, I mean,
it's really not that complicated. Yes. I mean, it is.
And so let's take the other side of that question, Russell. Is there hard data showing that requiring voter ID would disenfranchise people? Meaning people that are entitled to vote wouldn't get to vote?
No, they've been arguing that. The Supreme Court said in 2008 that voter ID did not violate the 14th Amendment. They've been saying that since before 2008 and since 2008. And the data shows voter participation going up. So they say it, but the data shows it otherwise.
So Donald Trump in an executive order, I can't recall what number it was.
I think it was Executive Order 1, maybe. I think it was his first one.
Was it? Okay, well,
yeah, it could have been.
Under I think it was the authority of the National Voter Registration Act, so he has federal law. This act requires states, or actually not states, it requires, used to be the Federal Election Commission, I think it's now the Election Assistance Commission, but it requires them to develop a form for states to use when they register people to vote for federal elections. And the purpose stated in the law, one of the purposes, is safe and secure elections for eligible voters. And so Trump's executive order says require presentation of one of these long list of possible IDs to prove citizenship before they register or when they register. And a judge in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, appointed by Bill Clinton, said, nope, Trump, you violated separation of powers doctrine, and struck that down. What's your view on that? Is that just judicial overreach?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a separation of powers. I mean, he can plainly ask the EAC and all these other organizations to do that. Some things he can do unilaterally and some things he can't. There's probably a few things in there that maybe were a little beyond his sort of clear authority, but certainly not the whole thing. And the claim it was a separation of powers is just frankly not true. I mean, I haven't read the opinion in a while, but he has a good bit of authority to ask the EAC to do a number of things. Now the EAC can maybe I think they have 6 members of the EAC commission, so there is sort of a deadlock there. Inherently, but he can certainly ask for it, and they can certainly promote it and through the policy of the DOJ and elsewhere. They, part of the executive orders are telling the executive branch to facilitate these certain actions, and so he can certainly order the executive branch to do whatever he wants, whatever the law allows him to do, and he can do that.
Yeah. So I mean, he's the only person, the one and only person in the entire executive branch that was elected by the people. And the court is saying you don't have the power to tell the bureaucrats how to interpret the law. That seems unconstitutional to me. That seems like the separation of powers problem to me.
Yeah, no, the court telling the executive branch what he or she can tell the other members of the executive branch that work under him is definitely a separations of power problem.
Yeah, that's the judicial branch controlling the executive branch. That's the separation of powers violation.
Yeah, I mean, the president's a unique office. I mean, maybe in the world, right? I mean, he's the only office elected by the entirety of the country. And, people think the president's elected by the states, but frankly, I mean, by the people, but the president's actually elected by the states. The states just allocate how their electoral clause go. And so it's a very powerful, very unique position, and it has checks and balances but he can certainly tell everyone in the executive branch what his policies are.
Well, let's talk about this mail-in ballot idea again. You mentioned it earlier. Here in Colorado, we get fed a steady diet of this stuff where we're told, oh no, they're safe. They require a signature on the back of the envelope when you send it in and all of these things. And they have supposedly are able to, the election workers have a screen that shows the signature that's on file, and then they compare it to the envelope and stuff like that. But is that really reliable? Do we want our poll watchers being signature verification people, or should there be a better system?
No, I mean, that's why you have a voter ID requirement, right? I mean, poll watchers are usually, poll employees, poll workers are usually just volunteers. Sometimes they get paid a little money, but they're not experts in comparing signatures. I don't frankly understand how they can. I mean, my signature looks different day to day, frankly. There's some semblances, but
yeah.
I mean, that's why it's been so great, like with Georgia, right? Georgia started requiring male voters to send a copy of their photo ID. I mean, they in the testimony in the hearing the other day, they kept talking about how people don't have access to copiers and all these different things. That's just simply not true. There's all sorts of different options. And frankly, there's other ways to vote that don't involve mail voting. So, if you need to drive, then you can drive to vote in person. But it's just, the signature requirement is I don't think we should abandon it by any means, but I think voter ID is what solves the bigger problem.
Well, and going back to something you mentioned earlier, the voter registration rules. So the system supposedly mails out a ballot to everybody on the voter registration rolls. Well, the instances are legendary of people being registered at empty lots, or they live at a hotel or some business address, and no one lives there, certainly not the registered voter. And these ballots are being delivered to these places. How do we know that they're not being scooped up, collected, filled out, or otherwise some method being used to substitute them into the system, filled out, completed in some way that's going to favor a particular candidate? How do we know that's not happening?
No, you don't know. I mean, you have several instances of people like, maybe living temporarily at a hotel or whatever. Everyone's got different circumstances. But if they're registered, if their registration address is a hotel and it's been that way for 8 years, there's probably something going on. And you have a lot of that, right? In mailboxes, et cetera.
Or empty lots.
Some people are empty lots. People are in different circumstances in life. And so maybe one time, they can get away with that. But that's why you have the list maintenance requirement, right? These people get flagged, and they're supposed to get this sort of process that either forces them off the list or makes them update their registration. And when states don't do that, you have 50 people registered at a house address. And so you have no idea who's sending that ballot back in. So, I mean, voting by mail was something that was proposed. I was reading the other day, it was proposed 100 years ago. It was a terrible idea. I found a historical book talking about all the problems with, vote by mail when the progressives recommended it in 1920. And it just won't die for some reason. It's back. And so, no, you have no idea what's going on.
Well, and so when you combine that with electronic voting machine tabulators, is this a recipe for disaster, right? I mail my vote in. No one is there to see who completed it, or there's no secrecy, no privacy, no security like you're saying earlier. It could be, that someone in that address is collecting all of them and saying, I'm going to fill them out and you're not going to have any say in it, or something like that. And then they get mailed in and they get scanned by a machine, and then they're considered to be legitimate, valid ballots. Is this a recipe for disaster?
Yeah, you got a lot of problems with it. You just do. I mean, the machines, the machines have their problems. The paper ballots have their problems. And then you got unverified votes coming in. And each one of the vulnerabilities attached to each one of those practices sort of add up to a real insecure election.
Doesn't federal law, I'm not sure if you could call it as law, but there's standards that have been adopted by, I think, the election something commission, anyway, I can't recall it, but on these voting machines, EAC, on the voting machines, and states are supposed to inspect their voting machines to make sure they comply with those standards. Am I right about that?
Yeah, they have different standards. The EAC is supposed to test them, and then they're supposed to put forth guidance on it all. It's all very technical. But yeah, the EAC is chiefly responsible, I think, for testing the machines.
One of the standards, if I remember right, Russell, is that they're not supposed to have any type of modem or ability to connect by Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or any other means to another device. And yet, my understanding is that machines all over the country have these built-in modems that even we're not aware of because the manufacturer puts them in the hard drive, puts them on the motherboard, and these types of things. Have you looked into any of those issues?
We have not. We've seen the reports of them. Obviously, machines are, capable of being hacked or manipulated. So no, we have not looked directly into sort of the technical aspect of it all. What I go back to, and this may not be really what you're, not really exactly what you're asking for. It's like, there's cheating in all sorts of forms. And so you really need to have multi-layered sort of a process that sort of involves a paper ballot and a machine. That way you can audit the ballot and check everything. I mean, the word ballot stuffing exists for a reason, because ballot boxes were actually stuffed. Yeah. So I'm not of the mind that the paper ballot solves all the problems, because the machine solves some problems too, but you can't go wholly one way or the other, right? You really sort of need a blended sort of methodology. And, to have modems connected to the internet that people don't know about is highly troubling, because, who's got access to that modem? So, those reports about embedded, really known about modems were very troubling.
Well, so going back to the Tina Peters case, a forensic audit was done by some private individuals of the copy of that server in that machine. And the records that were on there showed the 2020 election and a municipal election in 2021. And they found that a secret database was actually created after vote counting began, a sub-database, and all of the tabulation switched over to this new one, and none of the election workers were aware of it. This new database began running the software, so to speak, and tabulating the votes. And then the other thing was 28,000 election files were destroyed and done away with in the so-called trusted build that the Secretary of State did in cooperation with Dominion Voting here in Colorado. And I'm just curious whether you were aware of those and what your reaction is to that. Does that indicate a significant issue that needs to be looked into?
I've seen the reports. We've not looked closely into it. I mean, the problem with some of the election integrity issues is there's so many of them in so many states. You sort of have to cherry pick what you wind up looking at.
Yes.
I've seen the reports. It's obviously troubling that there are reports that they're creating data that no one knows about. I mean, the machines are a little bit of a black box, which is why it's nice to have the ballots you can audit after the fact too.
Well, yeah, but doesn't that assume that we know where the ballots came from and all of that sort of thing? If the whole verification process is done, on the machines, then who's to say, right? So, but let me ask you this: I've heard it said as well that what we need, as far as the machines go, is we need to be able to get to the source code and the programming on these machines so that can be reviewed and analyzed, and that we're not able to get to it, that the manufacturers of the machine won't release this source code, and that it's somehow proprietary or whatever, so we have to let them be in charge of that. Is that a problem in your mind? Does that make any sense to you?
I'm not a data security expert, but I mean, everyone says that open source is usually the most reliable data, right? Because it can be tested from all sorts of vector attacks. And, the fact that they call it proprietary and we can't see it, it's sort of worrisome. It's worrisome to me personally. Like, I mean, if I was, when I deal with security stuff for my own personal stuff, I tend to gravitate towards open source because I know they've had vector attacks from a number of different ways, and they have bounties and all sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, it's worrisome that they're not releasing that information for auditing.
So tell our viewers what you mean by open source.
So open source is this idea, like say this Microsoft Windows, right? And Windows has, Microsoft owns the data, owns the coding and all that, and it's all embedded and you can't see it, right? You can't see it. And then an open source is stuff that's just put on the internet. You have this code and it's put out there, and frankly, technicians from all over the world can see it and scrutinize. And there's like a bounty system and there's a reward system for finding the vulnerabilities on it. And people like build their careers finding the vulnerabilities in these things. And it's, it helps earn, it's sort of street credit, so to speak, because it's been through 100,000 people scrutinizing it as opposed to 500 people internally scrutinizing it for weak points.
Yeah, yeah. And the people that are going to scrutinize it out in the public, they probably have less chance of having a vested interest in how that software operates. So, well, as I look back over the last 4 or 5 years on this whole issue, one other thing that comes to my mind is the lawsuits that the software companies, the voting machine companies, filed, some of them very high profile, like the one against Fox News and some others that were all settled for the most part. There was some other litigation that was not necessarily settled, but where like lawyers were fined and censured for their remarks publicly and stuff like this. I'm wondering, Russell, about this, just you and me, lawyer to lawyer. I don't know what happened in those cases as far as discovery goes, but do you know, was anybody really allowed to get at, or did anybody make an effort to get at the internal documentation in these companies? Like, did they try to subpoena or otherwise get in discovery, copies of these election companies' internal emails, documents related to programming, software development, communications with outside parties, and things of that nature? Do you know whether any of that was allowed?
So I do a little bit, but it depends on which cases you're talking about. Like you have the post-election suits where the allegations were made by people like Sidney Powell, and then those cases were dismissed. And then you had the libel and slander cases brought by places like Dominion against those individuals. The second cases, I don't really know what they were allowed. I would assume they got some discovery, but they were overwhelmed by other lawyers. I doubt they really got much of it. In terms of the first cases where they did the post-election challenges, they tried to get that, but they never really got any of that information.
Yeah, because I'm going to admit, I'm uninformed. That's why I'm asking the question. But as a lawyer, I'm thinking, well, if we need to put this thing to bed, what we need is some good, robust discovery at these voting machine companies. We need emails, we need notes, we need memoranda, documents, everything like that. We need a request for them to preserve their records or an order to preserve it so that auditors and investigators can get in there and figure out what really is the story on these machines. And I'm asking if it sounds like you're with me, you don't know of any evidence that has really ever happened.
No, I don't think it did. And frankly, knowing litigation, I know the people on the receiving end of those lawsuits didn't have the resources to force it, right? I mean, it's a war of attrition when you've got big law firms on one side fighting against people to try to take their license and sue them for hundreds of millions of dollars. One side you've got 50 lawyers, the other side you have 3.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get through discovery. It's a buzzsaw, frankly, and they probably didn't get any of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so let's talk about this thing where some of these states like Pennsylvania started this process in 2020 when they started counting ballots after Election Day. It used to be, hey, you want to mail in your ballot, that's fine, but you got to make sure it's postmarked by or it's mailed in time to get here. But they stopped doing that. What's the story on that, and is that a practice that we need to get rid of?
We'll know if it'll get over. We'll get rid of it on March 23rd when the Supreme Court hears our case. So yeah, it's a process that's just really abhorrent. So historically, ballots had to be in by Election Day, and you would know by the end of the night basically who won. In 2000, there was an election dispute over the Bush v. Gore election, and then in response to that, the federal government enacted something called HAVA, the Help America Vote Act.
Yep.
And as part of that, they created something called a provisional ballot. The provisional ballot's basically this ballot, you show up at the poll site and you don't have your ID, or you don't, maybe at the wrong poll site, or your registration's off, or maybe you've moved and you've got an inaccurate voter registration, but you know you're supposed to vote. Rather than fight it out at that moment, you cast a ballot, put it in an envelope, and you hand it to the poll worker, and it's provisionally received. So it's called a provisional ballot. And you've got some period of time to show back up a couple of days later with your ID or with whatever it is to sort out the dispute over registration. Well, when that enacted in 2004, all these other people on the other side, the left-leaning ACT organization said, oh, okay, well, if you're going to let people come in and cure their ballots a week later, we should just let absentee ballots come in a week later. And so that practice slowly began in like 2004, 2008, roughly. And so there was a few extra ballots coming in late. No one really worried about it because it was sort of not that many. I hate to be that way, but it's like it didn't change the outcome of elections too much. But then you go to all mail balloting, right? And so you go from 1% of the vote is coming in as an absentee ballot to 45% of the votes coming in as absentee ballots. And now you're saying, well, we don't know what's going to be the electoral outcome in Maricopa because they need 6 weeks to receive all their ballots or whatever the deadline is. I mean, I can't remember. They needed like 6 weeks. I think they needed 3 weeks for the ballots to come in and 6 weeks to count them or all. Some ridiculous extension.
Yeah, Nevada was the same thing. Yeah.
Nevada, Illinois is 14 days, California, I mean, you pick them. And so that was part of what we sued with Congressman Boss in Illinois. That was our first suit. We filed a second suit in Mississippi, which allows 5 business days, so effectively 7 days. We represent the Libertarian Party of Mississippi in that. The Republican National Committee filed a sister suit. We were consolidated, and we lost at the trial court. We won at the Fifth Circuit, and that decision's been appealed. And on Monday, we filed our brief that basically explains why, when Congress enacted the 1845 and 1872 statutes, that it cut off the state's ability to extend ballot receipt past election, because a ballot is not a vote until it's received, right? You can change your ballot the entire time. It can be lost. People don't know this, but you can recall any letter you mail if you can identify it beforehand. The Postal Service has mechanisms to pull your ballot back. So until the moment it is received in the mail, it can be pulled back. And so we won at the Fifth Circuit, and we're hopeful that by the beginning of the summer, we'll have a ruling from the Supreme Court, either explaining, hopefully saying that will not be allowed any further, but if not, helping the public understand why this corrosive practice is allowed to go on. So we're pretty excited about it. It's been a lot of work. We took a lot of lumps for 3 or 4 years to get this thing heard. We filed in California for Congressman Issa. And so we're really excited to finally get an answer to this.
Yeah, and that case you said is going to be, is it oral argument in March, or you expect a ruling in March?
Argument March 23rd. I suspect the ruling will come out in June. Late June, probably, one of the last ones.
The name of the case is what?
Watson versus Republican National Committee et al.
Okay, excellent. And so just give us, if you would, Russell, sort of your top 3, maybe top 5 things reforms that we need across America to make our elections safe again.
Voter ID, more aggressive list maintenance requirements, a ban on all mail balloting, election day receipt mandates. That's 4 right there. I would consider it a win if we could get those 4. Voter ID, and when I say voter ID, I sort of fold into that citizenship proof, right?
Yeah.
I sort of consider those almost the same thing, but they're a little different, right?
Well,
voter ID.
Let me say this: they are different because in Colorado, you don't have to be a citizen to get a driver's license, right? So,
correct.
You get government benefits, you automatically get a driver's license, and you're automatically enrolled on the voter ID, on the voter rolls as well. So,
and the citizenship is to get on the rolls, and the voter ID is to show up and vote. So they are different, and I don't mean to just gloss over them. But
no, it's okay.
I mean, you really shouldn't be talking about citizenship because, frankly, it should be just a given that they have it proven. And frankly, you hear a lot of this stuff from the left saying, well, it's already illegal to vote as a citizen, as a non-citizen. Well, that's true, but it doesn't mean you can't get on the list and go vote. It's a after the fact they can get you for it, but they can't stop you beforehand. And so it's preposterous to say it's already banned, because it's not. It's just we have a remedy if we catch it eventually.
We have a situation in Colorado where Jenna Griswold's office sent 30,000 ballots out to illegal aliens. Oh, sorry,
Twice.
guys. And then she, of course, she didn't take the blame. She blamed it on her staff. But, you know, yeah, this is a problem.
She did that twice.
Oh, I wasn't.
She did that twice. She sent for two different election cycles. She sent out at least one that I know of, a solicitation to register, and then another one telling you to register. And it's just, you know, like she's setting up people to commit crimes, frankly.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of the things I didn't hear on your list there, and your list was awesome, right? So thank you for that. But one of the things I didn't hear was anything about these machines. Do you think we can have, do we need some more regulation, or if we're going to use machines, do we need to reform something here? This seems to be, to me, if we don't do something in that arena, we're not going to really have confidence again in the outcome.
I think that's right. I don't know that I know exactly the answer to fix it all. That's what I struggle with. Like, what is the silver bullet here for it? I mean, everyone's like hardcore ballot or hardcore, you know, machine. I'm more of a both, because people were cheating in the 19th century, right? They had paper ballots, and there was plenty of cheating that went on then. So, you know, you can't forget that past too.
This is true.
You know, and so. You know, I'm not a technician in terms of software and all that. I mean, you know, I understand the blockchain's got some opportunities there, but, you know, I've said that to people and they acted like I was crazy that were very familiar with the blockchain. So I don't know the technical stuff, but I do think that we need to be able to verify the elections after the fact, right? Public disclosure in the sunlight, even if I don't like the outcome, is really important to making me feel confident that it was done right.
Well, I would just tag on and say, I think we've got to have that software, those machines, has to be subject to standards and inspection, public reporting, and everything else. The open source idea sounds great to me. You're going to have people debating that forever, though, if you do that. But still, it would be better than this secrecy that we have now and using private vendors like we're doing with no disclosure. So, well, anyway, fantastic. It's been really educational, Russell. I really appreciate you coming on Truth and Liberty today. Tell us how people can learn more about Judicial Watch and your work and how they might be able to support your ministry.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I mean, we're online and everywhere, Tom Fitton or judicialwatch.com. We're definitely on Twitter and X, whatever they call it now, and then I'm on there too. I put out my little comments about the election-specific stuff, Russell Nobile at X. But yeah, no, we have so many members all over the country. Our members have been great, you know, big members, little members. They all help us to sort of stay with these cases that have just, you know, that most people, I mean, you're a lawyer, most people don't have the resources to litigate a losing case for 4.5 years till you get to the Supreme Court. And our members allow us to do that. And I'm just so grateful for that. And so that's the best place to find information on us.
Hey, thank you so much for coming on Truth and Liberty. And again, to all of our viewers, I wanted to mention our free product giveaway, my booklet, The Calling to Manhood. You can pick this up by going to our website and sharing your information, your email with us, and you'll get on our newsletter list. We'd love for you to have this. Every man is made by God, designed by God for a purpose and a calling. So get this booklet today and discover what that is. God bless you all. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time here on Truth and Liberty.